Okay, so I'm going to talk about curing unloved diseases and a DAC model for funding clinical trials. And like Amy was alluding to, I'm going to use long COVID as an example. Over the next 8 minutes or so, I'm going to try to convince you that, one, long COVID is a big problem, and we're not on a great societal track to fix it. And two, that we can actually use decentralized technologies and frameworks to create moonshots to solve these issues. So, like we just mentioned, this is not academic for me. I myself had long COVID. My initial infection was in 2020. And initially I had a pretty mild infection. I was like relatively young, relatively healthy person. And just had this 2.5-year degradation of my life. My symptoms just kept getting worse and worse, didn't know why. And it was pretty scary, and I started to get desperate. But in December of 2021, I saw this paper, this preprint actually from the NIH, which totally changed my life. And that was an autopsy paper. And what these researchers did was basically to look at tissue samples from all over the body for people that had died from other causes often, but many, many months after their initial COVID-19 infection. And what they found was SARS-CoV-2 virus all throughout their brain and their body. In some cases, for example, in the brain, it had been in there so long that it had actually started to mutate, which is horrifying, but it's also kind of hopeful in that maybe what we really needed was, or what I really needed in this case, was antivirals, right? Some way to clear the existing infection out of my body. And so that's what I started to do. I had a science background. I'd done a little bit of virus work. I was a neuroscientist before, a medical device inventor, and so I kind of dove into the scientific literature to try to figure out what I could use and started keeping track of everything I was doing. And these antivirals started to come out in 2022. First, I tried Paxlovid, which is a pretty common drug now for COVID-19. Didn't fully help me. And then later in 2022, I used a combination therapeutic of Paxlovid plus a long-acting monoclonal antibody called Evusheld. And I did 3 treatments of that over 3 months. And by the second treatment, all my symptoms completely went away, and I've been symptom-free for like almost 3 years now. And so that was a really hopeful story, because I think for a lot of people with long COVID, and you'll know this if you're on long COVID Twitter, which I don't know why you would be, probably don't recommend it, but a lot of people are actually really, really losing hope, and sometimes they're taking their own lives, and it's a really desperate situation, right? And so I started to talk to people who I thought could help. So Jake Landville, who is an amazing computational immunoengineer, Annalise Barron, who's a bioengineering professor at Stanford, Ruth Ann Crystal, whose daughter has really bad long COVID. She's a doctor at Stanford who helps with, runs this really large COVID-19 newsletter. And we just started basically trying to figure out how we could take my N of 1 and turn it into an N of many, And that's where we created this thing called Long COVID Labs, which is a decentralized group of patients and scientists. It's a DAO, accelerating a cure for long COVID. In January, we did a community auction and raised a little bit of seed capital, and that has allowed us to create this platform for what we're calling a moonshot. And the premise of this whole moonshot is basically, there's kind of like 2 assumptions here. One assumption is that the primary cause of long COVID is actually viral persistence. It's the virus sticking around in your body after your initial COVID-19 infection. And the second premise, the second assumption that we're using here for this moonshot is that the most efficient way to actually cure this disease, and maybe many others, are what's called adaptive trials. And so what is an adaptive trial? This is kind of what it looks like, and I apologize for the obstruction on the screen, but what you can kind of see is basically a lot of different potential treatments for, in this case, long COVID. This could be any disease though, right? And the thing about an adaptive trial, what it does is instead of replicating like how a clinical trial typically works, you have like this very serial, one person gets a grant and they do some research and they publish it, and then maybe they get another grant and some other organization might be doing, or some other lab might be doing similar sort of related work on a different compound, but with different endpoints, and it's not coordinated, right? And what that ends up creating is a lot of waste. And so what an adaptive trial does, and it says actually no, let's run this trial in a very coordinated and standardized way so that as we're going through these cohorts of patients, so for example, Paxlovid or the first case studies that we're doing with long COVID labs, which are Pemgarda and Paxlovid, kind of similar to the combo that I use to treat myself, we can use these statistical frameworks to actually see at predefined time points, is viral load going down? Are people's symptoms getting better? And before a trial even stops, we can start to move people that were originally going to be in, let's say, intervention number 1, and move them into intervention number 4 that seems to be working better in real time and very, very cost effectively. And so adaptive trials are basically a way to, in one go, run a parallel experiment on a bunch of different treatments and find a cure as rapidly and as cost efficiently as possible. We can even do things with adaptive trials like these utility functions where we take not just measurements of viral load going down. In the case of long COVID, right, we're trying to, in this case, decrease the virus that's in people's bodies. But we can also add things like values that we care about. Like, for example, maybe we want these drugs to be as accessible and cheap as possible. You can actually use that as part of a utility function in the statistical framework to guide this adaptive machine and help us rapidly converge on cures. And so we double down on this decentralized ethos. In all cases, and wherever possible, we're sending people these boxes which allow for decentralized blood collection, biosensors like ECGs, so you can get continuous and remote data collection of things like HRV measurements, which have been shown to change in acute COVID-19 infections, and simple and intuitive apps so that people can, even if they're sick, log their symptoms and can get that at predefined checkpoints and time points. All of that data then feeding into a patient dashboard for people so they can see how their illness is actually progressing, own all their data, and export it whenever they want, but also take all of that information into this Bayesian adaptive trial design where this machine, this like decentralized on-chain clinical trial machine is sort of running in the background, taking all this data in real time and figuring out what cures are going to work and what may not. And we can even do things like publish that data using things like zero knowledge proofs so that any researcher can access the data in a permissionless way, but that it preserves privacy. So I'm almost out of time, and so I'll just leave you with this, which is, there's a lot of diseases out in the world that are unloved, and long COVID is certainly one of them. There's 100 million people at least that have this. It's costing at least $1 trillion a year. That's like 1% of GDP. It's a lot. But the efforts by pharma and government are really, really slow. They're not going to solve this problem on our own. And so we need to help them. And I think the way that we can do that is by not only investing in these and understanding and using these decentralized technologies, things like adaptive trials, but also thinking about open access and DAC legal frameworks as well. So things like nonprofits, which is how we're structuring long COVID labs, to hold things like the IP that is generated out of these trials, right? I mean, imagine the value that pharma companies put on intellectual property in all these clinical trials. We can hold that inside of these nonprofit organizations, giving not just DeSci tokens and tokenomic reward structures impetus into driving these cures, but also sitting alongside things like traditional philanthropy and governments so that we can basically ensure that not only are we finding drugs cheaply and efficiently, but we're also able to license them at terms that are open access and available to as many people as humanly possible. And that's what we're up to at Long COVID Labs. So if you're interested in learning more or you want to talk, I'll be around, and that's our Twitter, Long COVID Labs.